The last time my mother introduced me in public, she called me the one who never really fit. She said it with a smile. Not a cruel smile. That would have been easier to hate. This was the polished kind. The kind made for wine glasses. Soft lighting. And people who would laugh. Because they assumed it had to be a joke. We were standing in the back garden of my parents' house outside Boston, at a memorial dinner for my grandfather. White tablecloths. Catered food. Too many candles. For a night that was supposed to be about grief. My sister was beside her. One hand on my mother's arm. Perfectly placed. Like always. I was near the far end of the table. Not exactly included. Not exactly excluded. Just placed. Where I had spent most of my life. Close enough to be seen. Never close enough to belong. Someone had asked who I was. That was all. A normal question. An easy one. And my mother could have said, "This is my daughter. Leah." 2 seconds. 8 harmless words. Instead, she glanced at me, then at the guest, and gave a little laugh. "This is Leah," she said. "The one who never really fit." A few people smiled politely. One man looked down at his plate. My father did what he always did when something ugly happened in plain sight. He reached for his glass, like he hadn't heard it clearly enough, to step in. I remember standing there, with my napkin still in my hand, feeling that familiar split between embarrassment and recognition. Embarrassment. Because she had done it again. Recognition. Because some part of me had expected she would. That was 3 years ago. And if the story ended there, it would have been one more elegant little humiliation in a family built on them. But last month, that same woman called me, with a voice so careful, it almost sounded maternal, and asked if I would come home for a private family meeting. She said they needed me. Not my help, not my opinion. Me. By then, I had a reputation of my own. I was no longer the daughter, standing at the edge of a long table, waiting to see if someone would claim me correctly. I had built a career in crisis strategy. People hire me when an institution is in trouble and needs someone calm enough to say which parts can still be saved. Hospitals, universities, nonprofits. I was the person people brought in when the public story and the private facts stopped matching, which is why my mother's call made me go very still. Families like mine do not reach for the inconvenient daughter because they miss her. They reach for her when something is leaking. She told me my grandmother's name had come up in connection with a memorial project. Something public-facing. Something meaningful. She said it would be healing for all of us to sit down together and talk about the future. Healing. That word almost made me laugh. My family did not believe in healing. They believed in containment, in saying complicated when they meant cruel, in calling silence dignity, distance maturity, and exclusion what's best for everyone. I asked why now. She paused a fraction too long, then said, "Because you're part of this family." Leah. I nearly hung up right there. Not because the line was insulting, because it was unnatural. My mother had spent most of my adult life speaking about me the way people refer to weather damage. Regrettable. Unavoidable. Best not linger on it. And now suddenly, I was family again. That meant one thing. She was scared. I said I would think about it. Then she made a mistake. Small. But not small enough. She added. There are some things it would be better to handle privately. There it was. Not reunion. Not grief. Not some late instinct to repair what she had broken. Control. A story that needed to be closed before it opened the wrong way. I told her I'd be there. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen. For a long time. Without moving. The window over the sink was open. I could hear the wind off the water. And a buoy somewhere in the distance. I live in coastal Maine now. In a house small enough that nothing disappears inside it. No locked sitting rooms. No performance dining. No photographs arranged to prove a version of love nobody in the house actually felt. I didn't agree to go because I wanted closure. That was never going to happen with my family. My mother did not believe in truth. If presentation could still win. My father did not believe in conflict. If avoidance could buy him another year of comfort. And my sister had built her whole personality around staying aligned with whoever held the center. I agreed to go because of something I had started remembering. Not a dramatic memory, just a detail from childhood that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. Quiet. Unfinished. The kind of detail adults assume a child will lose. But some things don't leave. They wait. They wait for the right sentence to make sense. They thought they were asking me to come back and bless whatever version of the story they were preparing to tell next. What they were really doing was bringing the only person who remembered it wrong into the room. If you had driven past our house when I was a child, you would have thought we were the kind of family people secretly wished they belonged to. Old brick, tall windows, a front garden that always looked recently edited. In December, there were wreaths. In summer, white hydrangeas. At Christmas, my mother made sure the ribbons matched the candles. And the candles matched the napkins. And the napkins matched the version of us she wanted other people to remember from the street. It looked warm. Inside, it was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Nobody screamed much in our house. That would have left evidence. My mother preferred softer forms of correction. A hand on the shoulder, steering you out of frame. A sentence redirected before it finished. A look that let you know you had misunderstood your place again. My father specialized in the gentler version of the same thing. He wasn't harsh. He was absent in highly strategic ways. He could stand 3 feet from a wound and still behave like nothing had happened. If acknowledging it would have required him to choose a side. Me sister, Nora, learned very early how to live inside that ecosystem. She was graceful, easy in rooms, naturally gifted at becoming whatever the moment rewarded. If my mother was hosting, Nora was useful. If my father needed peace, Nora was agreeable. If there was tension in the room, she could smooth herself over it and act like that counted as kindness. I used to think she was simply better at being loved. That is the kind of lie children tell themselves when the truth would be too big to carry. I was not difficult. I was observant. Which, in some families, becomes the same thing. I noticed when conversations changed. The second I walked into a room, I noticed when my name was missing from stories about the girls. I noticed that when relatives visited, my sister's piano recitals and school prizes somehow came up naturally, while anything good about me arrived only if someone asked directly. Leah's doing well in school. Leah's always been independent. Leah likes to keep to herself. That last one was my mother's favorite. It sounded harmless, but what it really meant was, don't worry about the distance. She prefers it. I did not prefer it. The only person who ever spoke to me like I was fully there was my grandmother. Evaine. She lived in Maine for most of my childhood, in a weathered gray house that smelled like cedar. tea, and old books. When I was with her, I never had the sensation I was interrupting the family by existing. She asked complete questions and waited for complete answers. She remembered the names of my teachers. She noticed when I cut my hair. She sat through long stories that would have earned sighs anywhere else. When I was 10, I spent 2 weeks with her, after a school year that had left me raw in ways I couldn't yet describe. I remember standing in her kitchen while she sliced peaches over the sink, and she asked, very casually, "Do you feel lonely in that house?" I still remember the panic that shot through me. Not because I wasn't lonely, because someone had seen it, without me having to perform it first. I told her I was fine. She nodded, like she knew I was lying, and loved me enough not to punish me for it. By the time I was 14, I spent as much time in Maine as my parents could socially justify. Summer breaks, long weekends, then school breaks that stretched a little longer each year. Nobody ever announced that I was being moved to the edge of the family. They just made central life in Boston easier for everyone if I was elsewhere. My room changed twice while I was still technically living in it. The first time, my desk was moved into a smaller bedroom because Nora needed more light for schoolwork. The second time, the smaller bedroom became a guest room, and my things were boxed so neatly, it was almost beautiful. My mother said it made no sense to preserve unused space when I was away so often. Away, like the choice had been mine. At 15, I stopped asking where I was supposed to sleep during school vacations. I just packed a duffel and took the train north to my grandmother's house. By 16, I had a job at a Marina Cafe in Maine and my own savings account. By 17, I understood something I wish I had learned later. If I wanted a future that felt stable, it would have to be one they could neither grant nor withdraw. So I got practical. I became the girl teachers described as serious, the one who met deadlines early, the one who didn't cause trouble. I learned how to build a life out of being underestimated. Scholarships, work, clean plans, no public collapse. There is one memory I came back to for years, though I never knew where to put it. I was 8, maybe 9. Early spring. The back hall, outside my father's study, still smelled faintly like wet wool, because guests had just left. My mother thought I was upstairs. I know that because of the way she spoke. Flat. Tired. Unperformed. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard her say, "She remembers things she shouldn't." I stopped where I was. My father answered too quietly for me to catch every word. But I heard enough. She was a child. Then why does she keep asking? You're overreacting. Emmy? There was a long silence. After that, I remember my hand on the banister. I remember the shape of the light on the wall. Then my mother said something that made no sense at the time. If she says it in front of the wrong person, I'm not cleaning up another mess. I moved before they could catch me listening. I went back upstairs, sat on my bedroom floor, and tried to understand what I had done for years. I assumed the memory was distorted, that maybe they were talking about something unrelated, and my child brain had stitched it into something larger because children always think everything is about them. But after my mother called last month, that memory returned whole. Not because I suddenly understood every part of it. I didn't. But because I recognized the tone, that same careful urgency, that same need to keep something contained, that same fear, disguised as control. And once I felt that old pressure again, other details I started rising with it. A photograph that used to sit in the upstairs hall until one day it didn't. A name I had heard once and then never again. The way my mother used to go completely still when I asked ordinary questions about who knew whom before she married my father. By the time I drove down to Boston for the meeting, I still didn't have proof, but I had something almost as useful. I had the beginning of a pattern. I drove back to Boston on a Thursday afternoon under a flat gray sky that made the whole city look polished and airless. My parents still lived in the same house, though it had been renovated enough to erase most of the versions I remembered. The front steps were new limestone. The door had been painted a deeper black. Even the brass hardware looked curated. My mother opened the door before I knocked. "Leah," she said. And for 1 second, she wore the face people trusted. Soft eyes. Measured relief. The expression of a woman who had suffered privately, gracefully, and now wanted only peace. It would have worked better if I hadn't seen her use that exact face on donors, trustees, and people she intended to win over, while giving away nothing real. She leaned in, like she meant to kiss my cheek. I stepped back, just enough to turn it into a logistical miss. Instead of an obvious refusal, my father appeared behind her, already wearing the smile of a man desperate for the evening to go well, without requiring anything honest from him. "You made good time," he said. That was his opening line. Nora was in the sitting room. One leg crossed over the other. Posture perfect. A water glass in her hand. She stood when I came in and hugged me lightly. "It's good to see you," she said. I believed she wanted that to be true. I did not believe she knew what it meant. We sat in the back library. A tray of coffee had been arranged on the table between us. No one touched it. My mother began carefully. "As you know, your grandmother's name continues to mean a great deal to this family." I said nothing. Apparently, they had spent the last several months discussing a memorial initiative in my grandmother's honor, not a foundation. She clarified quickly. "Something smaller. A scholarship partnership with a regional arts and education center. Public enough to matter. Limited enough to control." She cared deeply about overlooked girls, my mother said. My father slid a folder across the table. "We'd like your name attached to it," he said. "Not financially. Unless you want that. That's not the point. What matters is credibility. You work in institutions. People would trust the project more if they saw you standing with us." There it was. Not money first. Legitimacy. I opened the folder. The packet was neat. Too neat. Branded mock-ups. Draft language. Press wording. An event concept for a launch reception in early fall. A board structure, still labeled provisional. And on page 4, under founding supporters, there it was. The Whitmore family, including daughters, Nora Whitmore Hale and Leah Whitmore. I looked up. "You already printed my name." My mother answered too quickly. "Only in draft materials." "In materials shown to whom?" "A very small circle." I kept turning pages. There were quotes, attributed to my grandmother, that sounded suspiciously sharpened into donor language. There was a section about the family's long-standing commitment to mentorship, which was funny enough that I had to set the page down for a moment before my face gave me away. Then I found the event outline. Opening remarks by my mother. Family reflection by Nora. Short statement from Leah Whitmore on legacy, resilience, and service. I read that line twice. You wrote a speech for me? Before asking whether I was involved. It's a placeholder, Nora said gently. I turned to her. Whose idea was that? Her eyes flicked to my mother. Then back to me. Tiny movement. Plenty of information. My mother folded her hands. Leah, please don't make this adversarial. We are trying to do something beautiful. I asked the next question, in the calmest voice I had. When did this start? Late spring, my father said. But my mother, almost at the same time, said, after the anniversary dinner. Neither of them seemed to notice the mismatch. I did. I asked who, at the art center, had seen the proposal. Again, the answers came, slightly out of rhythm. My father named one person. My mother named another. Nora added that nothing had been finalized. My father then mentioned a planning conversation with legal counsel that my mother appeared not to know. He had revealed. By minute 12, I understood the real shape of the evening. They had not brought me in early. They had brought me in late enough that the thing already had social weight, but early enough that refusal could still be framed as emotional instability instead of formal opposition. I closed the folder. What exactly do you need from me? My father exhaled, like we were finally being reasonable. A unified front, he said. Not your blessing. Not your input. A unified front. My mother leaned forward. We've all had our differences, she said. But at a certain point, adulthood means deciding what matters more, old discomfort or family dignity. That phrase reached across years. Family dignity. I stood. I'll need copies of everything, I said. Partnership correspondence, governance drafts, any outside communications that include my name. And I want to know who approved using me in materials before I agreed. My mother's expression did not change right away. Leah, she said, this is a family discussion. No, I said, it's a reputational request, disguised as one. My father's jaw tightened. Nora looked down at her glass. Then my mother smiled again. But this time, the softness had thinned. I was hoping, she said quietly, that at your age, you would have developed more perspective. That was her old method. If guilt failed, reduce the other person to immaturity. I told them I'd review the documents and be in touch. My mother asked whether I would attend the launch dinner next month, at least as a courtesy. While things were still being settled, I said no before she finished the sentence. She walked me to the front hall. When we were alone, she lowered her voice. There are parts of this family you do not fully understand, she said, and I would be very careful before forcing private history into public spaces. There it was again. Not a reunion. A warning. I turned to look at her fully. That sounds less like advice, I said, and more like fear. For the first time that evening, something naked crossed her face. Brief. Gone fast. But real. I drove back to Maine, with the folder on the passenger seat and the old pressure building behind my ribs. By the next morning, I had started checking the seams. First, the Art Center. Their website listed no formal partnership, but an archived event calendar showed my mother's name, attached to a planning committee from 3 months earlier. Not late spring. Then a local donor newsletter mentioned support from multiple generations of the Whitmore family, which was interesting, because I had supported nothing. I took screenshots. Then I looked at the event files. Metadata showed edits from a consultant whose firm specialized in image recovery after nonprofit leadership scandals. Image recovery. I kept going. A press contact list had been embedded in one of the PDFs by mistake. Next to several names were short internal notes. Warm. Can be counted on. Needs reassurance after spring issue. And next to one local columnist. Only if Leah participates. I stared at that line for a long time. They did not need me to help build the thing. They needed me to calm down anyone who was already hesitant. A search through older local coverage found it buried in a small culture column. A former staff member at the Arts Center had raised quiet concerns about donor influence, blurred governance, and legacy families using charitable projects for social laundering. Suddenly the timing made sense. They were not creating something new and asking me to join. They were trying to stabilize something that was already wobbling. And they wanted to use me as the part that looked credible. That should have been enough to make me walk away. It wasn't. Because once I saw what they wanted from me now, the old memory from childhood stopped feeling abstract. She remembers things she shouldn't. If she says it in front of the wrong person. My mother's fear had the same structure then that it did now. Around noon, I got an email from Nora. Just checking in. Mom feels you were hard on her last night. I know emotions are complicated, but this doesn't have to get ugly. If everybody stays calm. There it was. Tone management. Cast me as volatile in advance. Define calm as compliance. 20 minutes later. My father emailed too. Shorter. Colder. We hope you'll remember that private family matters can have broader consequences when mishandled. That was almost refreshingly honest. I wrote back with one sentence. Then send me the full documentation by 5. My mother replied, instead of him. We are trying to include you. Please don't force this into something it doesn't need to become. I looked at the screen and felt something inside me settle. They had not invited me back because they believed I belonged. They had invited me back because they still believed I could be managed. The first real break in the story came from a photograph I had seen 100 times and never truly examined. It showed up because I went looking for the one image I remembered disappearing when I was a child. There had been a framed black and white photo in the upstairs hall, outside my father's study. Not large. Easy to overlook. A summer shot from years before I was born. For years, it had sat between two landscapes. Then, one spring, it vanished. No explanation. Just gone. So I called the one relative who still kept things instead of editing them. My great-aunt Helen. My grandmother's older cousin, who lived outside Portsmouth and had the kind of memory people underestimate because she delivered it in a gentle voice. When I asked whether she had old family albums, she said, "Of course I do." Like the question itself was silly. I drove down that afternoon. Helen's house was warm, overfurnished, and gloriously uninterested in appearances. Nothing matched. Everything was real. She brought out 3 albums. A biscuitin, full of loose photographs, and a stack of old holiday cards, tied with blue ribbon. I found the image. Within 20 minutes. Same lawn. Same angle. But the framed hallway photo, I remembered, had clearly been cropped. In the full version, my mother wasn't standing beside my father at all. She was angled toward another man. Just outside the part of the image I had been allowed to know. One of Helen's careful labels on the album sleeve gave me his name, Daniel Valle. The name hit something already loose in me, not because I knew who he was, because I had heard it before. Once. Maybe twice. When I was very small. Then never again. I asked Helen who he was. She hesitated, in exactly the way older people do when they realize history has arrived, before the family's approved version of it. A friend, she said first. I waited. Then she sighed and corrected herself. Not just a friend? Helen told me Daniel Vale had been around for years, before my mother married my father. Charming, unreliable, artistic. The sort of man families describe fondly once he is safely dead and no longer capable of ruining a seating chart. There had been gossip, she said. Nothing public, but enough that my grandmother never entirely trusted the timeline of my parents' engagement or the speed with which certain stories had been cleaned up after. Your grandmother thought your mother spent half her life managing optics, Helen said. The other half? She spent punishing anyone who made the optics harder. I asked whether I knew any of this. Helen gave me a sad look. I think Nora knows. Whatever your mother found useful, for Nora to know. Before I left, Helen handed me the holiday cards. Take these if you want, she said. There are notes tucked into some of them. She was right. There were notes. Not confessions. Just scraps that became devastating when laid side by side. Dates. Thank you messages. A mention of seeing Daniel again at a spring opening. A tense note from my grandmother about all this reckless overlap. A card written months later, congratulating my parents on putting the unpleasantness behind them. My mother had not simply curated the family narrative after the fact. She had built it that way. From the start. On the drive home, another memory surfaced. I was 9. Rain on the windows. My mother in the breakfast room, sorting old envelopes into 2 piles. I had been sitting on the floor with colored pencils. There was a name on one return address that caught my eye. Val. I remember looking up and saying, very casually, is that the same Daniel from the picture? Everything in the room changed. Not loudly. That was never how danger worked. In our house, it changed the way ice forms over water. Faust. Silent. Total. My mother set the envelope down, too carefully. What picture? The one upstairs? I said. The one where you're standing next to him? She stared at me for one long second. Too many. Then my father walked in. Took one look at her face and understood enough to become still too. I remember that now, with horrible clarity. Because that was the day the photograph disappeared. That was the week my mother started sending me to Maine more often. That was the season adults around me began acting as if distance were a practical decision instead of a reaction. I pulled over, halfway to Portland, because my hands had started shaking on the wheel. Not because I had uncovered some cinematic secret, because the secret was smaller and crueler than that. I had not been pushed to the edge of the family because I was troubled, or difficult, or less lovable. I had been pushed there because I noticed the wrong detail, asked the wrong ordinary question, and kept existing with a memory my mother could not fully control. Back in Maine, I spread everything across my kitchen table. The copied photograph, Helen's notes, the cards, screenshots from the Arts Center materials, my parents' mismatched timeline, Nora's email, my father's warning, and for the first time, the 2 stories merged. What they were doing now was not separate from what they had done then. This memorial project, I was not just about image recovery after a governance issue at the Arts Center. It was about locking the family story back into place, using the one person whose presence I could make outsiders trust it. Me. Contain the threat. Control the frame. Move the inconvenient witness far enough away that her version sounds emotional, if it ever returns. I thought about my mother, in that breakfast room, about how quickly her face had changed when she realized I remembered a man she had worked to edit out of the house. I thought about my father, who had seen the danger too, and chosen, as always, not truth, but manageability. I finally understood the structure of my role inside the lie. I was never the daughter who failed to fit. I was the daughter who remembered before I had the language to understand what I was remembering. My mother did not exile me because I embarrassed her. She exiled me because I made her history unstable. By then, I knew exactly what the meeting in Boston had really been. It was not an invitation back into the family. It was a containment effort. And it had arrived about 15 years too late. To work? I did not call my mother. After that, I did not send a dramatic email. I did what people like my family hate most. I stayed quiet long enough to choose the room. The launch dinner for the memorial project was scheduled for the following Wednesday at the Arts Center in Boston. Small guest list. Local patron. A few board members. 2 reporters. From regional culture publications. Just enough publicity to create legitimacy. On Monday, I sent a short message to the center's executive director requesting a meeting before the event, not with my family present, just the 2 of us. Plus, counsel, if she preferred. I attached nothing in that first email except one sentence that made a meeting impossible to refuse. My name and likeness appear to have been used in project materials without my consent, and I believe there are material omissions relevant to governance and donor representation. She replied in under an hour. By Tuesday afternoon, I was back in Boston, sitting in a conference room with the executive director, the center's outside attorney, and a board chair whose expression told me he had expected a routine clarification and was beginning to understand he had not gotten one. I laid everything out carefully. The draft materials, with my name, the pre-written event language, the donor note stating that one columnist would be reassured only if I participated, the metadata linking the campaign files to a consultant whose job was image recovery, the inconsistent timeline from my parents, and finally, the photograph and supporting family correspondence. Not as gossip, as context for why I believed my mother had a long pattern of editing reality when reputation was at stake. I was precise. Calm. Boring. Even. That is often the most devastating way to tell the truth. No one interrupted me until the very end. When the attorney asked, to be clear, Ms. Whitmore, are you alleging financial misconduct? No. I said, I'm alleging reputational manipulation, unauthorized use of my name, and a deliberate attempt to present a false picture of family unity in order to stabilize a project that already had credibility concerns. The board chair took off his glasses. The executive director looked physically ill. By 5 o'clock, the launch dinner had been quietly postponed, pending review. By 7, my mother called. What have you done? She asked. No greeting. No pretense. Just the question, beneath all her others. I corrected the record. Her silence, on the other end, was so complete. I could hear the faint echo of the room around her. You had no right to drag private family matters into a professional setting. That's interesting, I said. Considering you were happy to drag my name into one? Her voice dropped lower. You are making a catastrophic mistake? No, I said. I'm ending a very old one. She hung up. An hour later, my father called. You could have handled this inside the family. I looked out the window of my hotel room at the street below. You had years to handle things inside the family. That is not fair. I laughed quietly. You knew? I said. He did not ask what I meant. You always knew how she operated. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every lie. But enough. Enough to watch me be moved out of the house, a little at a time. Enough to sit there while she introduced me, like a problem, in front of strangers. Enough to let my name become useful only when it helped stabilize something public. He exhaled, like a man setting down something heavy he should have picked up 20 years earlier. I was trying to keep the peace. No, I said. You were trying to keep the arrangement. He did not call back. Nora texted, close to midnight. I don't know what's true anymore. Of all the messages I received that week, that was the only honest one. I stared at it for a long time before writing back. That makes two of us. The difference is, I'm done pretending not to notice. The next morning, the center's board issued a neutral statement. The memorial initiative had been paused for governance review and family representation issues. Still, the effect was immediate. The columnist, whose reassurance had apparently depended on my participation, published a short item about the postponement and noted that questions had arisen over whether all named family members had actually agreed to be involved. Another donor withdrew. Someone on the planning committee resigned. Quietly. Of course, quietly is how respectable people panic. My mother sent 3 more messages that day. The first accused me of humiliating her. The second, said my grandmother, would have been heartbroken by my cruelty. The third was the only one worth keeping. You have always had a talent for misreading things that were meant to protect you. I saved that one, not because I needed evidence anymore, because it said, in one sentence, almost everything. By Friday, the project was dead, not publicly buried, just unworkable. Once my name was no longer available as a sealant, the whole structure lost its clean finish. That should have felt like victory. Instead, what I felt was lighter than victory and less dramatic. Relief. The following Sunday, I drove to my grandmother's grave in Maine with a thermos of coffee and the original uncropped photograph in my coat pocket. It was cold enough that the ground still held the last stiffness of winter under the grass. I stood there for a while without saying anything. Then I took the picture out and looked at it one more time. My mother, young and angled toward the life she had tried to edit. My father, already standing in the frame that would later become official. A whole future hidden in one crop. For years, I thought survival meant forcing myself back into the picture. It didn't. Survival meant understanding that some frames are designed to shrink you, no matter how well you stand inside them. A week later, I filed the paperwork to establish a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name through a small Maine foundation she had quietly supported for years. No family board, no public dinner, no launch quotes, just money, structure, and girls who would never know they had been saved from becoming part of someone else's performance. I did not ask my parents to contribute. I did not tell Nora until it was done. I did not send my mother the link. That was my ending. Not a courtroom. Not a confession. Not a tearful apology. On the front steps of the house, where I had spent half my childhood trying to take up less space. Just a clean refusal. A corrected record. A choice. My family had spent years teaching me that my place among them was conditional. Awkward. Easily revised. They were wrong about the part that mattered. I did have a place. It just was never going to be inside the life they built by cutting pieces out of the truth. And once I understood that, leaving stopped feeling like rejection. It felt like authorship.